Welcome to CivilNet. Today we're joined by Sossi Tatikyan, the project coordinator at Freedom House. Sossi, thank you very much for your time.
Emilio, thank you very much for inviting.
So first off, can you explain to our watchers who do not know what is Freedom House and what is Freedom House trying to accomplish in Armenia?
Freedom House is a non-profit organization in the United States, and it is advocating for the values of democracy and human rights, in particular for civil liberties and political freedoms, but not only, also rights for marginalized groups and a number of other human rights and fundamental freedoms. And it has several kinds of work. One of them is the research work. You have perhaps seen global indexes and annual reports by the Freedom House. It has three kinds of reports. The first one is freedom in the world. The one for 2020 came up in March. And the second one is called Nations in Transition, and it will be published later this month. And the third one is Freedom on the Net, which will be published in several months. So it does this research, and it is basically a watchdog human rights defender organization, and it advocates for democracy, including in Armenia. We have a project here which is called Advancing Democratic Culture in Armenia. It is the first ever project of Freedom House in Armenia, and it is very much focuses on disinformation, but not in terms of fact-checking and media literacy, but much more on false narratives that are created through disinformation. And let's note that disinformation is not the same as fake news or misinformation, because disinformation is basically means spreading false narratives with a particular purpose. In our case, to polarize the society, and we see that it's working quite well in Armenia, unfortunately. And then it has another program which is aimed at defending human rights defenders and civil society all over the world when they are targeted either by the government and authorities or by the opposition and reactionary groups. And finally, it has the programs, and the project I mentioned is part of the program.
And Freedom House published its annual Freedom in the World report, which we have cited many times here at CivilNet. And the report details concerns and progress in each country of the world. Can you outline, when it comes to the case of Armenia, what areas Freedom House is, let's say, satisfied with or sees some progress in, and what areas are a cause for concern?
So Armenia has a score of 55 out of 100 maximum, and it is considered partly free. And in terms of political rights, it has 22 points out of 40 maximum, and in terms of civil liberties, it has 33 out of 60. So since the revolution in 2018, it has had 10 points of increase in total, and this year it has had 2 points of increase. 2 points are about very particular criteria. One of them is about corruption, and this increase by 1 point is conditioned by adopting some institutional mechanisms against corruption, which still need to be materialized and show the results. So we can say that it's a tentative increase by 1 point, and it is very much consistent with Transparency International assessment. The second point is about the right of property and easiness to do business. And it just records the fact that during the previous authorities, some businesses had problems to do business because there was a lot of political interference by the authorities, and it seems that this is not a case any longer. However, we should be really careful and take a note that this report is for 2020, so it ends in December. And sometimes, the reactions of such global indexes are a bit slow because there is an expectation for reform, of course, after the revolution 2018. And the reforms have happened in some areas, but in some areas they have been very slow. For instance, there is no progress in judicial reform this year. In electoral issues, there was a political party law that was adopted on 26 December. However, the rating for electoral process is still the same. So we will see this year with the adoption of new electoral amendments and if we really have snap elections, how that will go for the next year. And in many other areas, the rating of Armenia has remained the same. And again, this mostly reflects the developments in Armenia throughout 2020. But as we know, since the beginning of January, we had a lot of new, very dynamic developments. So we need to wait and see the next reports.
And Freedom House highlighted the government's decision to cut funding for the Human Rights Defender's Office, which is the Human Rights Ombudsman in Armenia. Why is the Human Rights Defender's role important for Armenia? And I also want to ask about the stigmatization of civil society, which was also highlighted but possibly gained less attention. And if you can unpack what Freedom House meant by the stigmatization of civil society.
Sure. Let me just return to the previous question and mention one thing that, in fact, Freedom in the World Report was called Democracy Under Attack this year. And it is the 15th consecutive year when Freedom House records deterioration of democracy globally. And this year, past year, it was conditioned by COVID situation because in relation to COVID, many countries adopted emergency measures. And of course, some countries tended to manipulate those emergency measures for political purposes. And also conflicts in the world, and one of them was Nagorno-Karabakh war, about which we can talk later, but let me address to your next question. We believe that Human Rights Defender's Office is very important, as well as civil society, especially in the crisis situation like Armenia, during the war and in the aftermath of the war. It's very important to support human rights and democracy institutions, meaning both Ombudsman's Institute and also civil society. So let's talk about Ombudsman's Institute first of all. It is an independent institute. It's not part of the government, and it is classified as A-class ombudsman by international human rights bodies, like by the UN, because it is considered very independent by international bodies. And its mandate is to protect citizens. And it has a huge scope of work and functions. As we have seen over the last several months, during the war, it was monitoring and writing reports about human rights violations, international humanitarian law violations during the war and after the war, including prisoners of war and severe atrocities during the war. And in the aftermath of the war, it has done a lot of work in terms of human security of the people in border areas, like in Sunik, etc. And at the same time, it's dealing with the whole scope of internal human rights issues in Armenia, such as hate speech, cause for violence, polarization, even disinformation and fake news, COVID-related situation, because during COVID, the volume of human rights complaints increased many times, multiple times. And it has a relatively small budget and relatively small staff. And it's very important for the government, at least, to maintain its support to this office. it does need means in order to do its work properly, right? So there were at least two developments that we found worrisome. The first one was that the government took away 3 out of 11 cars from the office, and you know, in order to fulfill so many functions, they do surprise inspections, they go to border regions, they go to prisons or police stations to do various kinds of monitoring and assessments. And they cannot just take a taxi and go to those places. The second and the most disturbing was that the government had proposed to abolish an article in constitutional law defining the mandate and functions of the Human Rights Defender's Office that would basically deprive it of its financial guarantees because the government could choose to decrease its budget next year. And in order to be independent, this office needs to be also financially independent. So we think that it's very important for the government to support this office and not vice versa. And then the second part of our statement comes, civil society. Well, civil society is quite marginalized and targeted, not just during the war and after the war, but even before. Over the last couple of years, there is this disinformation campaign against the civil society, and it's not just in Armenia. It happens in Eastern Europe, ex-Soviet countries, but in Armenia it's very particular. It works very, very effectively, unfortunately, this disinformation campaign. Why? Of course, because we had a war, which had a very unfavorable outcome for us, and we have national security implications, and our society is extremely polarized, and everybody is just trying to find somebody to scapegoat for, to blame for. And one of the main scapegoats has become the civil society. On one side, the opponents to democratic reform blame the civil society for advocating for democracy and human rights values, and they think that they are the one that is guilty for the defeat in the war. On the other side, democracy and human rights values themselves are being stigmatized, which is very disturbing, because I personally would never believe that democracy and human rights were the reason that we were defeated in the war. It doesn't make any sense. We can talk a lot about it. And on the other side, the government doesn't really take measures to address those attacks and stigmatization. For instance, there were several cases of attacks on offices of media organizations and civil society, and there were some serious threats to particular civil society actors. And the government and the law enforcement bodies, in particular, like the prosecutor's office, didn't really take measures to address those concerns. And Human Rights Defender made some statements about it last month, urging the law enforcement bodies to take measures to protect the civil society actors. And also, the government doesn't consult with the civil society sufficiently, especially in the last several months. So the civil society is doing a lot of work, but it's kind of in the shade and doing a lot of backstage work during the war, after the war. However, it's not really considered so much. And of course, good news is that their work on the new electoral code was taken into consideration, and at least one important amendment of electoral code was taken into consideration by the government. However, the government needs to consult with the civil society and human rights defender much more, and also take note of their criticism of the new bills that are coming up consistently now without much consultation with them.
And Freedom House also spotlighted certain legislation pertaining to the media. Recently, a new defamation law is being proposed which wants to introduce higher fines for slander, for example. Some are already describing this proposed law as restrictive with regards to press freedom. Can you explain this legislation to our watchers and what may be problematic about it?
Yeah, by the way, yesterday the president made a statement. He refused to sign this law, and he said that his office has examined this bill and also the statements of the local civil society and international human rights defender and media organizations, and they have sent it to the Constitutional Court to verify its compliance with the Constitution. And there is apparently at least one inconsistency with the Constitution, which says that any kind of penalties and fees to the media organization should not threaten its sustainability. So you see, if there is some very rich media organization sponsored by some oligarch or some very strong political force with a lot of financial resources, maybe for them $5,700 or $11,400 penalty for an insult or defamation doesn't matter. Maybe for them it's not a big deal, but we know that in Armenia there are already not so many independent media outlets, and normally independent media outlets are not so rich, right? Armenia is not particularly a rich country. So for them, these amounts can be a very serious amount of money, and maybe they will get bankrupt and not be sustainable. And the thing is that those phenomena like defamation and insult, yeah, we all know that we are living in this polarized environment with a lot of disinformation, and it's not good to insult or discredit public figures and politicians, true. But where is the line between criticism, healthy, constructive criticism, and insult and defamation? It's not really easy to define. There are no definitions so far in the legislation. So which means that if a politician or a public figure doesn't like criticism, he or she may sue the media organization and use this legislation for political pressure. So this is really restrictive, and it actually contradicts some norms of Council of Europe and European Convention, which Armenia has adopted still more than a decade ago. And our international lawyers have mentioned it. In fact, even the Justice Ministry, not only Human Rights Defenders Office and civil society and media organizations were against this legislation, and it also doesn't look so good that the authorities don't really take into consideration, don't consult sufficiently before adopting this kind of legislation by the government or by the parliament, because there were numerous statements, and we actually, as a Freedom House, we facilitated our second public discussion on this particular topic. It wasn't just about this bill, there were 5 bills of this kind, all restricting media or freedom of expression. 2 of them had some positive elements, and one of them, which refers to anonymous sources, is being reformed now. The Parliament MPs have promised to take note of the criticism and make amendments. However, overall, there are new bills coming up of this kind that are basically, it's not clear whether they will be efficient to tackle hate speech or defamation or disinformation. But one thing is clear, that they will restrict freedom of expression and media.
Well, Sossi, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much for the interview.
And thank you for joining us on CivilNet.